Before we introduce ourselves, it's a real pleasure to be here. Documentary editing is really an incredible art, as probably a lot of you know. Editing is really the craft of documentaries in a way that maybe is not so much in narrative films. So even if you're not documentary filmmakers or editors or producers, there's a lot to sort of learn just by listening about the editing of documentaries. It's about story construction. It's about creating character where they don't exist. It's about creating, a movie where there is nothing on the page. So first, why don't we introduce ourselves? You could tell us who you are and a little of your background. Both of these are incredible editors, longtime editors with really notable credits. Why don't we start with you, Carla?
So I'm Carla. I've been doing this for, I think, 14 years. What else?
Well,
I like documentaries.
How did you get involved in editing? Let's start with that.
Well, I went to film school for documentary production, and I found that production gave me a stomachache. So, but in the edit room, I really loved it, and other people seemed to be really stressed about it, and I really thrived, and I liked the mental stress. So I decided that was the thing for me.
Same here. I went to NYU undergrad for film, and the summer of 1982, I was doing cross country. I was AC. I thought I was going to be a cinematographer, but getting up 4 a.m., eating instant noodles every day just didn't work for me. So I took an editing class at NYU, and my mentor was Paul Barnes.
Do you guys only work in nonfiction? Do you guys, is that something that where you originally have always come from?
Yeah, I've only done nonfiction. I went to a program that was only nonfiction. It was only documentary, so we dreamt about documentary and only talked about documentary. So I knew that that's what I wanted to do. That was my passion. And I don't know. I mean, maybe one day I'll delve into fiction, but I like it.
I actually interned for Sally Menke at NYU, and on her very first feature, Cold Feet, that was probably the only time I ever worked in narrative. And then I became Sally Menke's assistant editor at CBS Reports, and that was the first time I actually really learned about documentary. That was 1985, and I just fell in love because the power of documentary.
And we're going to definitely dig into some clips in a second, and we'll start breaking those down. But just sort of, is there an overview, like when you talk about yourself as an editor? Carla, we could start with you. Just how you sort of see yourself as an editor. How do you describe yourself? What are do you think your traits when you're sort of talking with filmmakers? What do you feel that you're sort of bringing in terms of your skill set in a way, as far as an editor?
Sure. I would say the way that I see the role of editors in documentary, they're like a very strong collaborator in crafting the entire story and the structure of the film. We a lot of times, sometimes when we show a single clip, we talk about the rhythm of it and how you build the emotion from the texture that you the combination of sound and video. But it's really the monster of the craft is really the big story and how you're building that arc and how you're setting things up early on and how that pays off later. So it's really, I think that's what we bring into the project. And we're writing the film with the director, I feel. So it's, and that's why I love it so much. I mean, we get to really have an imprint on how the story comes out through the process of editing. So, I mean, one of the biggest challenges that we were facing when we were editing was how the heck are we gonna make the law interesting? Because when I first heard and read, the legal documents and her argument, because everything was recorded, I just didn't understand anything. And we talked about it with the directors, and we had to really cut it down a lot and figure out the essence of her documents. I mean, this is revolutionary thinking, and what she was doing was just incredible. But also, how do you make that, how do you make that connection with the audience? And it was really that was one idea that I brought to the directors, is like, how do we make the pages kind of jump out visually and like make an emotional connection? And that's when we decided to use the photographs of the woman, because that's what she was doing. She was humanizing an issue for these judges. And like, I just always find like a really incredible power of seeing people's faces, like just looking directly at the audience. And that's how we came together. We came up with this idea of showing the woman that she was writing about in her legal brief. And that happened throughout the film, just kind of like the legal talk that she had, like how were we gonna address it, to make it understandably, to make it simple, and to make it emotional in the film. And hopefully we did a decent job with that. And then, the use of archival, I think when I'm working with archival, I'm always trying to paint, a portrait of the moment, and to be able to like take the audience as if they were walking with our protagonist. Early on, where we're just kind of seeing the pictures of the plaintiff, that's something different. But once we get to the Supreme Court, you're really kind of walking with her, and that's how we're cutting the footage. Like the tilt-ups and like, this big, it's like this little woman in like male-dominated space. So what are the shots that you're choosing to tell the story? Like the picture of her looking up, because that's where she was going, like this big imposing building. So all those kind of like little textural decisions are just to build that, to build that moment emotionally and to take you there as much as we can, from her point of view as much as possible.
The film has all this like great verite of the justice now. Were you looking at these scenes stylistically different from when you were using the verite footage of today?
Yeah, those moments were kind of limited. There were verite moments with her, but they were very short, so we didn't have a lot of that footage. And it was more structurally the way that we were thinking about it. Like where we needed to kind of like bring you back to the present and see you the way that she is. It's the conversation we had with the directors early on. It's like they really did not want to, they really wanted to put up front the power of this 80-year-old woman as she is now, with her wrinkles. And like, we talked a lot about like, it's like how sexy that is, and like to just put it up front and to sprinkle it throughout the whole film. But stylistically, I think it's like where it fit into the story, kind of like what it needed to do at that point, how it was reflecting, thoughts about the past. If we needed it to be kind of slow and give us a breather, that's how we edited those moments.
There's also, I think for any like writer or director in the room, the movies, it's not chronological. It bounces between. It doesn't just follow, from her beginnings to. It's sort of, if I remember, it bounces between a case, and it's sort of very nonlinear.
Both. It's actually it's quite linear, and we try different things. It's quite linear when you go to the past, although we made some leaps, but that
keep bouncing back.
Yeah, but it keeps coming back to the present in a way. But the historical stuff is a bit linear, but we use kind of narrative tools that are non-linear. So
is that something that you're finding in the editing room, or is that something that you are sort of thinking about before and then going ahead and kind of creating that?
I think it's both. I think that, Betsy and Julie, the directors, would, I think, agree with this, is that, sometimes at the very beginning, everybody's like, let's not make a linear film. Like, let's, play with timeline and sometimes it's like the easiest things to kind of fall back into this, like, okay, that's not working, and let's just go linear and then make a film work, the first pass of the film work, and then maybe experiment later on. But it's both, really. You're talking about like structurally all the time. Like you're gonna try something, and then if it doesn't work, you're gonna try something else.
I have to say, I stay away from historical documentaries because they're the hardest. actually. It's when you talk about deconstructing, it's all about constructing when you work with historical docs. And the pacing, everything's just so beautiful. No, it's difficult.
Same with Apollo. I saw it. Not like
Yeah. I mean, I did want to sort of single that out. The pacing is really, really, really amazing in a way. It's a lot sort of slower, and it sort of takes its time and really lingers on images and sort of forces the audience to kind of look at the images. Is that something that you're thinking about when you're editing, or how do you find that pacing?
Everything again is at the service of the story. I mean, our opening is pretty fast and like, it's kind of like a montage of things. And when we go into like her hip hop, Notorious RBG performance, like the pacing is quite different and the energy is quite different. So the pacing is really kind of at the service of the emotion, I think, that you're going for. And yeah, I would say that I'm the kind of editor that I'm not really afraid of like using big music when I need to use big music, or to just embrace the silence and slow pacing if that's gonna kind of draw more emotion into it. And it's something that you just kind of have to work until the very end.
Jean, you have a couple clips that we were going to show that are, it's very interesting. It's sort of like a comparison, an A-B. Do you want to sort of explain those? And I should mention that, as you sort of alluded to, you've worked on some very, very big movies, especially for Barbara Koppel. This is one of the smaller movies you've worked on in a way, right?
It's small. It turned out to be the biggest impact that I've ever had on any films. So this is Plastic China, and I'm going to show two openings, before the director's first vision and then our final vision. And just, when I say the biggest impact, this film actually changed policy with recycling. So people around the world now doesn't know what to do with the recycle. So it is the biggest impact. So just a little introduction. I met the director. He's actually a journalist and environmental activist. So he's not really a filmmaker, but he spent 2 years shooting this little village in northern China, and just, because his first film also made a huge impact within China about garbage dumps. And this one, he spent 2 years, and first 6 months just really, finding the character. And so when I first watched this, I was at the Sundance Lab in Beijing, actually. And so he has this approach. It's kind of shocking. It's very journalistic approach, but all the facts, and the characters are all ID very clearly, and then just go to the horror. So we can watch that first, and then I'll stop and just show you the final version.
And I think this is also about 4 or 5 minutes as well.
3 minutes.
So was this edited by the director, or were you sort of executing what he was thinking?
Actually, at that time, he had an editor, but then he also edited himself. So I would say it's long take. So he did edit himself.
Cool. All right, so this is Plastic China from the rough cut.
So this one, for me, when I watched it, I talked to him, and why do you want to open with this? He said, it's really shocking, see a woman giving birth in this field. And actually, when I watched the first rough cut, there were many shocking moments because, it's just horrible, the condition. There was a shot of a little boy taking a little syringe out of the recycling dump and just, squeeze into the mouth. I just constantly being shocked. I say, I don't think I can watch this. You're not going to get your audience by constantly shocking your audience. So when I went through a lot of footage with him, and actually my editor, Bob Lee, he really ended up editing the film in China. So I become a supervising editor, actually, and the executive producer. And so I made a suggestion, which you're about to see, is the scene that I'm going to show next actually took place about 60 minutes in his version. And this birth scene in the final film that he started in the final version actually got moved to about 33 minutes. So it's all still the same ingredients, and it's just how you tell the story. It's like how you let the energy flow, you know. And so the next one, it still has the information but I won't give away too much. I just want a more cinematic approach. So let's show the next clip.
What I think is so kind of incredible about that is, you know, you saw the first version and it's sort of so like kind of clinical and just it feels like just here's the facts, here's the names, here's the shots, moving on, here's something that happens, and it just sort of like looks like almost like selects on a timeline. Whereas this is so much more evocative in terms of bringing an audience in and sort of funneling the story from the bigger picture to the smaller. Is that something you're thinking about, like when to try to bring an audience in at the beginning? Like, how does the beginning of the movie sort of impact how you're thinking with the editing?
You always want to bring the audience in the first 3 minutes, you know, otherwise they're, you know, in the old day they just flip the channel, of course. But for me, I actually, when I watched the rough cut, the minute I saw the kids playing in the dark, that for me was just so magical. And I just thought that's so inviting. It's also like a metaphor of a birth. It's actually, for me, in my mind, that's also a birth scene. You know, the canal, you know, the kids come in with a flashlight. So, and I'm just having fun sometimes. I don't overthink it. I just play with the material and see how things fall sometimes. And actually, when I was in Beijing working with the Sundance Lab, at that time, Bob Lee came on board. And I just, you know, there's a blank, I said, here's a blank wall. And I asked Bob, what is the most powerful scene for you? And we put it on a little Post-it. I said, just stick in the middle. And then we kind of work around that structure, you know, the index cards everybody love, the editors love. And I just, you know, it's almost like, you know, the three of us, there were three of us, the director, Bob, and I. We just kind of look at this wall and just start putting our scenes together. And I always say, let's just put the birth scene at the beginning.
I'm eager to get to the Chavela scene, which Carla cut. But before we do, I mean, this also gets to a little heart about documentaries, which is this sort of conflict between cinema and journalism. And in both of your films, and all the films that I've seen of your that you guys have edited, there's a real sense of cinema. You know, it's visual, it's an experience, it's about watching it. It's not just a piece of news footage, it's not just talking heads. How are there things that your techniques and ideas that you guys are both thinking about to kind of make to make it more cinematic, to bring an audience into it as a movie?
Yeah, I mean, what I'm always have like, you know, the little voice that keeps saying like show don't tell throughout the whole process, you know, and you always kind of like fall into exposition because that's kind of like the easiest, more direct way of like giving information to the audience. But I mean, that's what I found so genius about this opening, is that there was so much information in those first 30 seconds of like, you know, a family or, you know, people being buried by plastic. It's just, it gives you so much information without just saying it out loud, but like in a cinematic, visual way. So I think it's just kind of like a mantra that I have to remind myself every day. Like, are we getting that information from other, you know, means besides somebody in an interview saying it out loud? And you have to kind of trust that. I mean, it's always really surprising to get to rough cut stage and people, you know, a lot of people are even seeing things that like you don't think are clear, but they're, you know, buried in there. So like how to get that out, you know, in a visual way without saying it.
Also, you know, I didn't know I was an American editor until about 12 years ago. I was in some Eastern European country, and I was showing Please Vote For Me. And someone said, oh my God, you're an American editor. I said, what does that mean? And then I realized it's the pacing, it's the way we tell our stories. And then for the past 12 years, I've been working with a lot of Chinese filmmakers, and the pacing is totally different. The sensitivity is very different. And I'm trying to actually now find the medium. And I started feeling, you know, need to give breathing room, but also just slow myself down. But also, that really depends on what the directors bring to the table. I can't make something cinematic if the director didn't bring me the ingredients.
Just to echo what Carla's saying, I mean, this also applies to narrative editing as well, where there seems to be such in a lot of, not great editing in the narrative space, there's such a reliance on dialogue and just having the actors sort of explain, whereas I think documentaries are so instructive in a way that they sort of remind you of the power of visuals, Yeah.
I mean, if you can just read the documentary in an article, like if you make a transcript of the documentary and you can read it as an article, then it's not, why film then? I mean, the film has such a power of like connecting emotionally that, the written word. I mean, there's amazing articles in journalism and stuff like that, but it's just that visual connection and the sensory connection that you can have with film that makes it so special.
Great segue, by the way, to our last clip, which is from Chavela. Beautiful and really cinematic as well. What could have been just another kind of traditional biopic. Do you want to set it up a little bit?
I'm just going to introduce our main character is this really famous Mexican singer who was kind of like an out lesbian. She wasn't out publicly until she was 80, but she wore pants when no Mexican ladies were wearing pants, and like wore a poncho and like her hair back, and she really made an impact on the music of Mexico. So that's all I'm gonna say, and we call this our sex scene during editing. So there you go.
Yeah, I mean, eager to hear about this, but I mean, what a powerhouse of a scene, and also something that seems like it could only have been created in the editing room. It's using the music in this incredibly sort of personal, impactful, kind of visceral way. I mean, tell us a little about where that came from.
God, now I have to go listen to her music tonight. After I edited that film, I didn't listen to her for a year because I offered to listen to her. But I think, it was from early conversations with the directors and doing the research, we realized that Chavela only sang songs that really kind of reflected her life. And it was a film where we had kind of like tiny little pieces of her voice from different interviews that were really heavily edited, and all the archival from Mexico had like a lot of music in the background. And we really wanted to use her voice to tell the story. So it was a film that was put together by tiny little, puzzle pieces. But we decided to just play with the idea of using her music as a narrative tool. And that's kind of when the film came together, when we started experimenting with that. I have to say, like, editing music with lyrics is the hardest thing just cutting it down and like all the voiceover around it has to fit. Anyways, it was kind of tough. But yeah, same with the clip that I showed with RBG is really, how do you take the archival, and even a lot more with Chavela, we tried to create this world where the audience was seeing her life through her eyes. So that was the intent that we had in our minds throughout the whole process. So, all the pictures of Frida is kind of Frida looking at Chavela and Chavela singing to her. And even with the Acapulco scenes, it's like Chavela looking at all these girls, and it really, the editing and the choosing of the shots really kind of had to reflect the sensuousness of her music. And so that was kind of our intent in terms of the rhythm and how we were editing.
For both of you, how do you not, especially in documentaries like this, how do you not get overwhelmed with the archive, when there's so much archive, and with RBG, obviously, and a lot of films that you've done as well, where there's just so much news material and archive. How do you get a handle on it? How do you harness it?
That's really...
You get overwhelmed and you go slip it off.
A great archival producer is so important in historical docs. And it really is overwhelming. Like the Apollo film, we have so much wealth of, from 1985 years of archive. it's just, I don't know. I give it to my assistant editor, actually, who always becomes my co-editor and editor.
Yeah.
It's just combing through it and get excited, and be careful with archives. Sometimes, they,
Unusable.
they give you stuff that you fall in love, and
Yeah.
then you can't touch that. It's a
The rights and
the
clearance.
rights and the music
fees,
rights.
yeah.
It's a lot. Yeah, it's a lot of work.
Yeah.
This is why I just admire historical.
Oh, thanks. I mean, I didn't show any variety to this today, but I think what happens later, I mean, that's like early, I get super overwhelmed by stuff, and excited about all the possibilities. And I think this applies to footage, in general. But I think later on, you know what that scene needs to be about. So you become a lot more like, this is the archival that I need, or this is kind of the texture of the time that I need. With RBG, I mean, we needed stuff from New York in the 40s, but it was also from the perspective of a little girl. So you start looking for things in a very specific way, and if you're missing something for a scene, the intention of the scene. So it becomes less overwhelming because you know what you're looking for.
Actually, recently I just went to Ice on the Price talk, and there are two schools of using archival. Some people use it more impressionistically. Some people have to be really authentic of what that footage represents. And for me, if you're really working with historical doc, you have to be mindful, because we may not be here. This film will last forever, and what people remember. So I think we have the responsibility of keeping authentic.
I think we're going to take some questions from the audience. We have a few minutes. He's asking about how much is scripted and how much freedom do you have in sort of building the story and in creating the film.
Well, it depends on if it's historical doc or is it a verite film. So I rarely work in historical docs. Usually there is a treatment, not a script. So you kind of know what beginning, middle, and end is. And most of the time I have all the freedom to really make the assembly to tell the story.
Yeah, I don't work from scripts. It's usually the way that we usually work is, I'm giving the footage and I have conversations about kind of the global vision that the directors have. And so I start looking at the footage with these big picture ideas that they've given me. And then we come back together again after having some time with the footage. And that's where, like, what is this film about? What's the potential? Like, maybe I introduce the idea of, like, you follow 4 characters. How about 3? And like, and maybe it'll take a couple of weeks for them to let go of the idea of, this character that they love so much. So it is that coming together is kind of like the first structural conversations that we have. And we a lot of times use index cards. Sometimes, I come to that coming together with an outline of my ideas, and that's when the back and forth really starts happening with the directors, and that's our guide to do the first assembly of the film.
So when you start editing a film, and do you start trying to figure out how you want to open the film first, or do you kind of just go into it, edit the entire thing, and then go back and say, okay, this is how we're going to open the film?
Actually, I always tell everyone, leave the open and the end at the end. Except for the Apollo film, it was the only time in my life I knew exactly how to open the film and how to end the film. It was very rare that ever happened. Yeah, I never touched the open. The open changes all the time until you really know what the whole film is about.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I've edited a version of the opening at the beginning, but it's really kind of, you have an idea of a structure that you want to try out first. And then after that, I usually just tackle the first thing that I tackle is something that, a version of it is going to end up in the film. And it's like a powerful moment. And And I actually do that just to build trust all around, to build trust for the, the directors have been working on this film for years sometimes, most of the time for years. So, but they haven't seen any glimpse of a finished film, like any glimpse of their baby. So, everybody's nervous. I'm nervous. Like, how did I edit all those other films? Like, I'm a fake, So, so my first kind of test is like, trust myself again. Okay, I can do this, but also present something that is polished enough that it gives a tiny little glimpse to the directors, and then everybody can like breathe easy, and then we go into the really hard work of like chunking the film out. I'm stealing this phrase from a great editor called Mary Lamson. Have you heard that? Chunk it out. I love that. So yeah, but that's how I choose what to cut first.
Yeah, so I guess like how deep do you go in the precision of the editing when you're first starting, and then also about order on those scenes?
I think that editing documentaries is kind of like a series of forcing yourself to make decisions. And you cannot be scared of making the wrong decisions because you'll have time to revise and change things. But if you start editing scenes that are, like about 3 different things, because they could, come in very useful and touch on 3 different themes of the film, then that scene is kind of nothing. Like, it's about everything and it's about nothing. So you just kind of have to make decisions and focus, and that's how I think I, tackle my editing. It's like, this scene is going to be about this one thing. And a lot of the times at the end of the process, that scene has changed and become something completely different, because when you watch your first assembly, it didn't work, but it has the potential to be something else, or it has the potential to be someplace else. But you just kind of have to believe in the process and just dive in and just force yourself to make that decision. Because a lot of the process is just stepping back and looking at it and seeing what doesn't work and trying a different solution.
And Jean, like when you cut a scene, do you know where it's going to be? Like if you're working on something and you chunk it out and create a scene, where is it going to fit?
It depends if it's a chronological story. Like when I cut Miss Sharon Jones, I cut from A to Z. I want to see how the life unfolds. And I don't fine cut. But sometimes if it's an issue-oriented film, you just work on the scene and really just, you have to play on the big picture. Yeah.
I mean, Miss Sharon Jones also was intercutting with her in the hospital and all of these things, so it's very complex. And that sort of order is something that you're... Yeah.
With that film, the problem is I didn't know who Sharon Jones was. Then I know that most people didn't know who Sharon Jones. So if I just show someone with a cancer story, and the story is building up to the first concert after she finished her chemo, so there's no way that's going to hold. So I start going through all her repertoire. There's not one composed music. It's all repertoire. It's all, I draw from the music, let the lyrics, the music to tell the story. And yeah.
That's a good one, Miss Sharon Jones, another Barbara Koppel film. Quick, I guess we have a couple more way in the back there.
In between the socio-political storyline of RBG, there's also this kind of subtle love story between her and Martin that's kind of weaved in there that reaches a climax kind of 2/3 into the film with his death. I was curious how you approached that and how you approached kind of measuring that story against the backdrop of the historical prominence of the judicial achievements she accomplished.
Yeah, we talked a lot about it. I don't know how many people have seen it, but the climax of the story, the final scene of the story is him dying, but then he tells the story himself of how they met. So you know how like you go on dates, double dates, and like you ask the other couple like, how did you meet? And you get the 2 different stories. Like that's a little bit of what we did with the film. But it was a very specific decision we made because we wanted to make sure that she was the one telling her story first. She was the one that talked about how they met and what significance he had on him. But it was actually, a part of the story that we always knew that was going to be very, very present in the film because he was very important. And she was very much in love with him. And he was also very important in the development of her career. So it's something that we couldn't overlook. And that was the first scene that I edited for them.
I've also heard from the director, and I think this gets to that sort of editor authorship question, that you were very instrumental in suggesting the relationship as one of the spines in the film.
Yeah, it was... It was the easiest scenes to edit were all her personal scenes. The legal stuff was a lot more difficult. So it was the first scene that we tried to edit was how they met. And it was very close, that version that we did at the very beginning was very close to how it ended up in the film. And we all just kind of fell in love with them and Marty. So we wanted to make sure that we came back to that story throughout the film.
It's also a reminder, like, it's a Supreme Court justice movie, but yet, at the heart of it is just this person that's a character in a movie, So she was asking about, if you shoot so much verite, all these different stories kind of emerge. How do you focus on the right story? How do you know where to go with that story?
I think after watching and building, it just organically is going to, appears in front of you. I actually once had a director who shot for 6 months and just throw away all 6 months of footage. And once he saw Travis is the name of the film, and when he met this new boy, that's the new direction. So really, to have the courage of let it go.
And the courage also applies like when you start editing. Again, going back to like you just have to make decisions, but the footage tells you, it's very clear when there's an arc that you can follow with characters, when you see a change in somebody or somebody becomes incredibly interesting and other characters are not so much, or but it is sometimes hard to let go because the experience that the directors have on the field and the relationship with those characters is very different from what you're seeing, just kind of through your edit system. But I think that's what we can offer a little bit. We can see those patterns, as we're watching the raw footage, we can see some of those patterns and some of those key moments where we know, we can see a character kind of like really take prominence in the story. Or a theme, or so.
And it does seem like with each passing year, more directors just shoot more and more. Now you're hearing about 1,000 hours for documentaries. I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah, I'd love to watch as much footage as possible. I've been able to in the, but yeah, it gets tougher and tougher.
Mary Lemson calls a vacuum cleaner.
Vacuum cleaner.
Technique.
So we do have to wrap it up. So I want to thank both of you. It's really, thank you so much. And thank you all. And, Jean, Apollo, as you mentioned, comes out.
I have a few films.
Oh, okay.
I'm
Tell
also
us.
executive producing Our Time Machine. That's probably going to be out. Yes, the Apollo's going to be out.
Great
and
film.
All in My Family's on Netflix.
Nice. And Apollo, of course, is about the Apollo Theater up in Harlem. And what would you have a film?
I'm working on a film called Pray Away. Look for it in a year or so.
Okay, Pray Away. Thank you very much.
6 months.